Hi, Dr. David here. Today I'd like to talk about what makes chemsex use problematic. What do you need to look for to find out whether this may be an issue for you or not? And in general, what we're going to be looking at is when the chemsex behavior and the use of these various drugs have an impact on our physical health, on emotional well-being, and on our relationships and how we work in the world, right? Our obligations and so on. So let's start with physical health because there's a lot of risk here. Basically due to the drugs that we see being used in chemsex. Methamphetamine, for example, causes this huge release of adrenaline and dopamine, and that will basically put the body into fight or flight response, where the heart races and eyes get big and so on. We're meant to be in that for a period of a few minutes. Methamphetamine will put that into a fight or flight mode for a weekend, right, for days on end, and that can cause a lot of heart attacks and strokes and pulmonary hypertension and so on. We also know that a lot of these drugs weaken the immune system. For example, methamphetamine has been shown to really weaken the immune system, and we also know that based on research that about 50% of people who regularly engage in chemsex will end up living with HIV. That's a very sobering statistic. That's largely due to injection drug use and so on. So that's a real problem that we see with that. There's all kinds of sexual health problems. People lose their ability to function sexually without any kind of the drugs on board. They become dependent on those drugs to be able to have an erection, to have an orgasm, to even get sexually aroused in the first place. So that's a huge problem. Sleep disturbance, tremendously disruptive. All these amphetamine drugs, particularly to regular sleep, which we need for mental and physical well-being. There's also a risk of overdose death, of course, especially now with fentanyl creeping in the blood supply, the drug supply rather, and also then, of course, dependence. There's a great risk of dependence, both physical and emotional, on these drugs. So that's the physical risk that's involved, and it's considerable. There's the mental and health struggles, right, of these drugs and how it amplifies them. We know that people who have anxiety and depression and trauma are more vulnerable to these drugs because these are great ways to cope with them by basically not coping with them. We disconnect, we dissociate, we go into another world, right? And we have, as one client of mine described it, 8 hours of bulletproof happiness. When we're high, we're not worried about anything else. But that's not a great way to exist, and it actually aggravates the problem. So if I have anxiety, it's going to make it worse. If I have depression, it's going to make it worse. If I have trauma, that PTSD is going to be actually aggravated and amplified. And now I probably have a thought concern as well, what we call a thought disorder, meaning paranoia, psychosis. And as I mentioned, that can lead to other more serious mental health disorders as well. That leads all to emotional instability, right? There's a lot of stress that goes with it, and shame and guilt and remorse, and kind of leading up to this behavior, engaging the behavior, and then the feeling like crap afterwards about oneself, what we've done, worried about things, having consequences again, making things worse. So this cycle of addiction that we get trapped in can actually start to make it feel much worse. There's a loss of control. This is a hallmark of addiction in general. So that loss of control, meaning I set a boundary, I'm not going to do certain things, and then I cross the boundary. So maybe I tell myself, I'm only going to use on Friday nights. Now suddenly it's Monday night, I'm using it again, and Tuesday night and Wednesday night. Maybe I tell myself I only use a certain amount, and I end up using much more than that amount. Maybe I say I'm only going to smoke and never inject, and suddenly I find myself injecting. So addiction is all about crossing those lines that we set ourselves, that loss of control over what we do. We're being constantly pulled by factors outside of ourselves that lead to risky behavior, to staying longer when we don't mean to, and so on. Yeah, that's another one I hear a lot. I'm only going to go out for 3 hours. 4 days later, people come back, right? Everybody that knows. And if you've been involved in chemsex, you know how familiar that's going to sound. It impacts on our daily life and relationships, right? Suddenly, chemsex is more important than going to work or going to school or taking care of my home life or my partner or family and friends or social obligations, and all that stuff kind of becomes secondary to getting and staying engaged in that chemsex behavior. And it's not just the acting out part of the vicious cycle. It's about the preoccupation, the time spent thinking and fantasizing about using, the planning, and then the recovering. So there's a lot of time spent, and it really starts to capture our whole lives over time. So that daily life starts to really be affected. It affects our self-care. We start to neglect things. We don't pay bills and so on. So in every area of our lives, they start to get kind of wobbly, and there's a lot of consequences on the smooth functioning of our daily lives. Social isolation. This is a great irony to me because a lot of guys, almost everyone I know who's engaged in chemsex, talk about the benefit of the social connection, the connected sex, the feeling at home with other like-minded people, feeling like they belong. These are all really positive feelings, right? And nobody can argue with those. The problem is that chemsex sets those up, since there's the sense of those ideas like belonging and being connected and being close. That's all dependent on the drug state. When people sober up, a lot of times those things disappear, right? And so people end up feeling lonelier than they might have started with. And so it's really something to be careful of. Risky behaviors is another one. How many people I've seen kind of living kind of what I call normal, in a good way, lives, and getting involved in chemsex, and suddenly they're out engaging in risky behavior with risky people. They're getting guns pointed at them. They're getting robbed. They're being sexually assaulted, particularly under the influence of GHB, and so on. So a lot of this disruption in their normal life can also cause tremendous upset. And I've seen, by the way, a significant number of guys get arrested, right? For they end up dealing, and with meth, it often ends up with federal charges, federal drug charges, which are no laughing matter, obviously. Escapism and emotional dependence, right? Many times I would take these drugs, the chemsex behavior will take these drugs to step out of their lives with all its problems into another world, right, where they don't have those problems. The problem is that they start to become emotionally dependent on that place to function in the world, to be okay. If they're not under the influence of the drugs, they start to get kind of shaky and wobbly emotionally. And so I think that dependence is something that we have to be very careful of and beware of. And finally, the biggest one I see as a sex therapist is sexual dysfunction. This dysfunction of sexual behavior is almost universal. So many guys I've seen have used chemsex to amplify sexual arousal, to amplify their sexual behavior, to get rid of inhibitions, to get rid of body shame, feeling hot and ready to go and able to go, right, for days in that sexual headspace. The problem is they become dependent on that space to function sexually. I've seen many people in recovery or after they give up the drugs unable to function sexually. They can't get aroused. They can't have an orgasm. They can't get an erection, and so on. So the sexual dysfunction is a really consequential impact, the sexual anorexia that people have. And that takes a lot of work and time and patience to restore sexual functioning. And you have to remember, sober sex is not going to have that impact of the dopamine and adrenaline that methamphetamine creates. But also doesn't have the problems that go with that, right? Sober sex can be intense, but it can also be meaningful and connected and vulnerable and loving and full of all kinds of emotional flavors besides just intensity. And so there's a lot to be said for that. So this is a lot of information, but if any of these kind of warning signs ring true for you, pay attention, talk to somebody, get some help. There's things you can do to prevent it from being worse. Dr. David here, signing out.